Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to today's BIC Stream session Myths about Rural India, Indian Agriculture Demystified.
Thank you, Lekha, and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Bangalore International Center, for convening and hosting this discussion titled Myths about Rural India, Indian Agriculture Demystified. I am Sandeepan, and I am the director at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, a research organization based in Bangalore. So, how well do we know the countryside? For most of us living in the cities and the metropolitan regions, the main source of information on the Indian countryside is the media, the print and television media, and now increasingly the internet driven new media. Today, however, we have three well known experts on rural India, each of whom has done detailed empirical village studies, and they will raise and discuss one proposition each. The objective here is to help us better understand certain salient features of India's rural economy. Their coverage of the rural economy will not and cannot, of course, be comprehensive, but knowing the three speakers, we shall certainly have much to think about at the end of today's session. We are grateful to Mr. Ravi Chandar and the team at BIC for suggesting this format for this evening's discussion. As Lekha just informed us, the three themes are three propositions, in the form of myths. The first proposition being the three farm acts will benefit the majority of India's farmers. This will be discussed by Professor R. Ramakumar. Then we have the second proposition: farming in India is a viable occupation, by Dr. Aparajita Bakshi. Finally, the third proposition or the third topic is the archetypal farmer in India is a man, to be discussed by Professor Madhura Swaminathan. I have no doubt that the speakers will bring theoretical and empirical experience to bear on their presentations. They have all been a part of the project on agrarian relations in India. This project, organized by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, has conducted detailed village surveys in 27 villages across 12 states in different agroecological zones in India. Without further ado, let me welcome our first speaker, Professor R. Ramakumar. Professor Ramakumar is an economist and professor at the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. His areas of interest include agrarian studies, agricultural economics, rural banking, microcredit, public finance, and national identity schemes. He is also the author of the book Notebandi, Demonetization and India's Elusive Chase for Black Money, published by the Oxford University Press in 2018. From September 2016, Ramakumar has served as a member of the Kerala State Planning Board. Ramakumar today will be speaking on a subject that has been debated academically, politically, and of course on the streets for more than 6 months now. What is the substance of the three farm acts? What will be their impact on the economy and the lives and livelihoods of India's farmers? What will be the impact of these laws on supply chains and markets? These are some questions that we seek clarity on from Professor Ramakumar. So may I welcome Professor Ramakumar.
Thank you. Thank you, Santiban. Thank you to the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and the Bangalore International Center for organizing this session and putting together all these speakers to speak to the audience. I will today speak about the question of farm acts, which appear to have been forgotten a little bit in India because of the raging second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's a good thing to bring it back into discussion because it is a live issue and it will come back as soon as the second wave ebbs a little bit. Now, let me begin the discussion in the following way. The role of the state and the market in agriculture has been debated a lot in the literature across economists, across policymakers, and so on. One of the most important consensus elements in this literature is that of market failures, that markets in agriculture, markets in rural areas, where large numbers, or rather millions or crores of small and marginal farmers on the one side, and oligopolistic, duopolistic, or monopolistic players on the other side, invariably gives you a number of reasons to robustly argue that markets would always are always likely to fail. And it is from this idea of market failures, from the fragmented nature of markets, from the questions of information asymmetry, from the questions of adverse selection and moral hazard, from certain goods being public goods, from certain goods having positive externalities, and so on and so forth, is the role of the state having been argued out very critically in the literature on economics and development economics in particular. So one of the first phases, or one of the first periods where you see state intervention coming in a big way, is not in India to begin with, it's actually in the United States. In the aftermath of the Great Depression of 1929, the United States brought forth what is called as the New Deal for the American economy, which also included a huge package for agriculture. That's the time when what we call in India today as procurement, MSP, etc., were first used in the world context, and that was in the American capitalist economy from 1933 and 34 onwards. Their Agricultural Adjustment Act and other acts were very important in bringing forth these issues of state intervention as critical features of the success of agricultural policy in countries of the world. It is in that context that this whole idea of state intervention through interventions in marketing, prices, procurement, etc., has come into being onto the world stage in a big way. In India, and I shall use a few slides to elaborate what I want to say in the remaining 17 minutes or so. Here, the point that I want to argue out is that this history of state intervention in agricultural markets in India dates back to what we call as the Green Revolution of the 1960s. If you look at this Green Revolution period, there were different forms of public institutional structures that were erected to assist in farming. They included price policy, input subsidy policy, credit policy, marketing policy, research policy, extension policy, and so on. But of these, two of these forms of institutional structures of the 1960s, that is price policy and marketing policies, are what are significant for us or relevant for us today in the discussion that we are having on the Farm Acts. So what was it in price policy and marketing policy in the 1960s? The price policy of after 1965 basically had a new national food policy at the center of the discussion. From here, there were two sets of concerns. One is both producers and consumers have to be supported. This is a problem. Producers need higher prices, but consumers need lower prices, right? So there is a contradictory set of objectives here, where one agent wants higher prices and another agent wants lower prices. So the state comes in between and enacts the national food policy, whereby there are support prices and procurement prices in order to assist the farmers through the Food Corporation of India, through the Agricultural Price Corporation, and so on, Agricultural Price Commission, and so on, and they fix these support and procurement prices, and the government procures these commodities and puts it out for public distribution through what are called the ration shops, the public distribution system. And this sort of system whereby the government stands in between the producer and the consumer, offering the producer a higher price and offering the consumer an affordable lower price, became a feature of this policy after 1965. So this was what was happening in the price policy. The difference between the procurement price or the support price on the one hand and the lower consumer price on the ration shop side was met by the government through a food subsidy from the budget. Then came the marketing policy. The marketing policy completely rewrote the rules of the game in agricultural marketing, whereby a small set of itinerant village traders who were allied to the semi-feudal economy of those times ruled the roost in the marketplace. This meant that all states were asked to enact what are called state level APMC Acts, Agricultural Produce and Marketing Committee Acts, according to which regulated markets or mandis were established. Large numbers of them were established, thousands of them. What were these mandis supposed to do? They were supposed to provide the farmer with better price discovery. What do you mean by that? When you enter the market, the price is very transparently displayed. On top of it, the farmer can actually auction the produce transparently in the marketplace and get the best price available for that day. Earlier, the traders who came to the village cheated the farmers a lot through non-standardized weights and measures. Now all of them are standardized. And also the farmer gets ability to store the produce for another day's sale. For example, if the price is supposed to go up tomorrow, the farmer can store it in the warehouse of the APMC mandi and stay there in a guest house and sell it tomorrow. So all these facilities became available to the farmer from this time. So if you look at the marketing chain or the typical supply chain that would emerge here, you would actually see that the farmer, this became the most important supply chain from the farmer to the consumer on the other side. Farmer would sell to the commission agent. The commission agent serves as an intermediary between the farmer and the APMC. And from the APMC, it goes to the secondary APMC via a trader, and then it goes to the consumer, mostly in the cities. Other channels also existed, but they were smaller in quantities in terms of the turnovers that they were handling. So this is what we had by the 1960s. But by 1991, the whole discourse was sought to be changed, both in terms of price policy and marketing policy. Proponents of agricultural liberalization asked for changes. And what were these changes? In price policy, it was argued that the food subsidy that the government meets standing in between the producer and the consumer, that food subsidy is actually a fiscal burden, it was argued. Then it was argued that the government standing in between these two players is actually an inefficient player. If you actually give it to the private trader, they would actually do a much more efficient job. That was the second argument. The third argument was that administered prices actually depress the prices received by farmers. Now, this is a bit of ironical statement because it was thought that procurement and support prices provide a better price to the farmer. The argument here was that if the government allows the farmer to export the produce, not intervene in through procurement and other means, if it allows to export the produce, or if it allows the farmer to sell it in the open market, then the farmer would actually get a much higher price than what would be otherwise available or what is presently available through the procurement system. So what should be done? It was argued that you minimize procurement to the minimum, you keep the minimum support price only to keep a small buffer stock and free up the rest for the open market. And on the other end, you don't need to run such a large PDS, so you can give it only to what came to be later called as the BPL population. That would be enough. So you can dismantle PDS or minimize PDS or even convert it into a simple cash transfer scheme. No food in kind is required in such a system. So this was the argument with respect to price policy. With respect to marketing policy, it was argued that India needs a diversification of its cropping pattern away from the rice-wheat system. It needs to move to high-value export-oriented crops. Economies of scale are important because you need large quantities to be handled for the export market, for processing, and so on. So what is to be done? You need one pathway could be corporate farming, whereby a large private company comes, leases in or purchases 500, 600,000 acres of land and cultivates in one go using modern agricultural practices and so on, and exports the produce or processes it or whatever it wants to do with it. But here there was a problem, which was that land reform laws were there, which were constraining this kind of possession in large quantities of land. So it was argued that land reform laws should be amended. Land ceiling laws should be diluted so that anybody can keep any amount of land to assist in this kind of a pathway. This was one argument which was put out. An alternative pathway was put out in the form of contract farming. What does contract farming mean? Contract farming here means that the company doesn't come and buy up the land or lease in the land. The land is still with the farmer. They continue to cultivate it, but they have an agreement with the farmer. The company has an agreement with the farmer where the company will buy a certain quantity of a certain product at a certain price, and the contract is struck at the time of sowing itself, so that the farmer would know what price would be available to the farmer at the time of the harvest. So this was another another pathway which was advocated. But here it was argued that the APMC laws are a constraint. Why? Because APMC laws insist that each APMC or mandi has got a notified area around it. In that notified area, all marketing operations are regulated by this APMC or its market committee. Now, this jurisdiction should be broken down. That was the argument here, which will allow private players to come in and and establish new private markets, for example. Or they can have large rural collection centers whereby farmers can come and sell their produce. So all these become possible if the APMC is simply deprived of its jurisdiction over the notified area. This was the argument. This is the context in which you have the farm laws coming in, first in the form of a set of model acts in 2003, then in the form of 2017 and 18 model acts, then you had the ordinance in May 20, and you had the passage of farm acts in September 2020. This is what we are discussing. So what is the first act? It is this Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Facilitation Promotion Facilitation Act of 2020, or the APMC Bypass Act, to be more for brevity, if you like so. So here it was argued that the bill creates an environment whereby the farmers and traders will have the ability of free choice of sale and purchase of agricultural products. It would eliminate the barriers to inter and intrastate trade and commerce, and it also would aim to create additional trading opportunities outside the APMC markets. The second was what was called as the Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act 2020, more precisely known as the Contract Farming Amendment Act. Here, according to the government, it empowers the farmers, the act empowers the farmers to engage through contract farming with processors, wholesalers, aggregators, large retailers, and exporters on a level playing field without any fear of exploitation. It would transfer the risk because the agreement is between that sponsor and the farmer. It transfers the risk of market unpredictability from the farmer to the sponsor, and it also enables the farmer to access modern technology and better inputs. Now, the third was called the Essential Commodities Act. This was a very different act, which was not part of our discussion till now. Here, what the commodities like cereals, pulses, oilseeds, edible oils, onions, potatoes, etc., were called essential commodities. And they had certain stock limits set on them with respect to what traders or exporters or retailers can actually store and handle at any point of time. All these were sought to be removed. And these commodities, all these stock limits were removed, and they can be regulated only under situations such as war, famine, or extraordinary price fluctuations on natural commodities. This was the third amendment that was brought out in the form of the third farm law. This is what we are discussing. Now, the first point to discuss here is with respect to constitutionality. Now, this is the first argument that has been placed. The argument here is that the central government bringing out these laws is actually unconstitutional. What is that? The act, it is argued, violates the federal principles of the Constitution, because if you look at agriculture, it falls under state list of the Constitution. Entry 14 of the state list is what is covered here. Apart from this, entry 26, entry 27, and entry 28 are also part of the state list, which refer to trade and commerce within the state, production, supply, and distribution of goods, and entry 28, markets and fairs. All these are clearly aspects of the state list of the Constitution. This is why earlier APMC acts were enacted not by the central government, but by the concerned state governments. However, entry 26 and entry 27 are subject to entry 33 in the concurrent list of the Constitution. Now, this is the loophole that the central government used to enact the farm laws, bypassing the legislative domain of the states. And this is what is being contested today. It is argued that this is a sort of a backhanded entry into the legislative domain of the states, and because only entry 26 and entry 27 are subject to the concurrent list, entry 33 in the concurrent list. Entry 28, which is markets and fairs, is not subject to the entry 33 in the concurrent list, this whole farm law enactment is actually unconstitutional. This is the argument that many states and individuals and organizations have put forward in their petition to the Supreme Court. Now, that is a case that is sub judice. We are not getting into that, but I just wanted to flag this question of constitutionality in the beginning itself. Let's come to the three.
Ramkumar, you have about 5 minutes to wrap up.
Yes, yes. So the first claim that the government puts forward is whether the farmers will get more freedom to sell their produce. That is the first argument put forward. Now, the problem in this kind of a claim is that this freedom is probably already present for the farmer. Okay, why do we say so? If you look at the data which is put out by the National Sample Survey Organization, if you look at all the paddy that is produced in India, only 29% is currently sold through a mandi. 41% is already being sold through a private trader. Same with wheat, same with maize and soybean. Large quantities of these producers are already being sold to private traders, that is, people of the choice of the farmers. Now, so de facto, this freedom that the government is saying it will be available is already available to the farmer. Why is it so? There are two reasons for it. One is there are not enough mandis in India. Okay, we need something like 41,000 mandis, but we have only 7,000 mandis. So a lot of farmers sell in the village itself. Second is that the transport costs are unviable for small and marginal farmers. Why? Because you have to you produce a small quantity, you have to take it to a market far away, and all that requires a lot of market transport costs, and that would be unaffordable to a small and marginal farmer. So they sell it in the village itself. This is the practice that is currently being followed. So, in a sense, de facto, this freedom is already being exercised by the farmer. Come to de jure. De jure also, the freedom already is present in many states because many states have already allowed for many of these aspects in their legislative changes over the last 20 years. For example, allowing private markets to come outside APMCs, allowing direct purchase of agricultural produce. All these are already allowed by many states. Yet, very little private investment has flown into these areas in these states. A classic example is Bihar, where the APMC Act was annulled in 2006 and absolutely no private investment came. Farmers moved from a bad situation to a worse situation because the market was captured by completely unregulated, unscrupulous private traders, and farmers lost all their access to systematically functioning markets in the marketplace. Example of Bihar. Example of Maharashtra, if you take, this is a state which denotified fruits and vegetables from the domain of APMC markets long back. Still, very little private investment has come in. The third example is that of Kerala, which ironically never enacted in its history an APMC Act. Yet, very little private investment has come into play in Kerala's agricultural markets. So, and wherever agricultural markets have indeed come, and you in Karnataka would be very familiar with the Raitar Sandai, all these are government facilitated markets, not private markets. Very little private marketing efforts have come up. I'm not saying they have not come up, but very little have come up as compared to the expectations. So freedom to sell, unlikely to come. Will the farmer get a better price? If you look at this question more carefully, the question is, currently the argument is farmers pay a lot of mandi taxes. These mandi taxes doesn't need to be paid anymore, and these mandi taxes can actually be transformed into a better price for the farmer. Can it be? No, because the mandi taxes will simply be replaced by a higher transaction cost that one has to incur in the marketplace. If you look at companies like Reliance Fresh, which come and try to collect produce from the rural areas, they have an office to set up, they have a rent to pay, they have staff to whom salaries have to be paid, then they have to collect produce from each farmer, grade it, store it, make a bank transfer to them, transport it to the nearest urban area, and then sell it there. All these are transaction costs. So simply the mandi taxes that are currently being charged will be replaced by private transaction costs of private companies. Now, will the farmer get a better price? only if the new private transaction costs are lower than the current mandi taxes. That is very unlikely according to most studies. So the higher price argument is also suspect in the current context. Sandeepan, I'll just take 2 more minutes. I'll complete it just to
Okay.
tell you that I will be finishing this.
Sure.
So the other question is, are mandi taxes form a current form of rent seeking or not? Here again, if you look at states like Punjab, you will see that a lot of these mandi taxes that are collected are actually used by the Punjab Mandi Board, the Punjab state government, etc., to invest in rural roads, private markets, and so on and so forth. A lot of rural toilets, rural sanitation, and all. That's where all this money is being invested. Roughly 4,000 crore rupees per month is, per year is collected this way, and it is spent on these kinds of investments in rural areas. All that money will be lost, and farmers and the government in Punjab are wondering, if the mandi taxes go out, go away, where will this 4,000 crore be replaced from? That is another question that people are worried about. Next question is, will middlemen be eliminated? Unlikely again, because you will basically see that the current intermediaries who are existing in the form of village traders and so on are likely to be replaced by new middlemen. Right? As they say, the old middleman will be replaced by a new middleman. The difference would be he would come with a suit and a jacket, probably. That's all. So that kind of a replacement will happen. And as long as you have on the one side large numbers of small and marginal farmers with very little facilities of aggregation among them, you will always need a middleman between the farmer and the marketplace. Unless that situation is remedied through, for example, in farmer producer organizations, for example, you will not have a way out of this quagmire. Farmer producer organizations exist, but they are very small in number. Okay, that is the problem that we have, and the current number of farmer producer organizations are inadequate to address the question or need for aggregation in a land of small and marginal farmers. I will conclude with one more slide, which is with regard to the contract farming legislation. I shall be happy to take up questions related to the Essential Commodities Act when the discussion happens. In the contract farming legislation, the key point to note is this: contract farming allows farmers a better price discovery on many occasions. There is no doubt about it, because the price would be known to the farmer at the time of sowing itself. Okay. Now, this is a good thing. This is the positive side of contract farming. But it comes with certain negative sides also, which have to be taken care of while regulating the sector. What is that? A, breach of contracts. He agrees to buy the product from a farmer at a particular price, but the harvest time comes, the market prices fall, the company finds it much more profitable to go to the open market and buy rather than buying it from the farmer. It simply breaches the contract. The farmer is left in the lurch. Okay, and the farmer, you can argue that the farmer can go to the court and all, but you know that our judicial system is highly biased and it might not be possible. The second important concern is concern related to food security, which is suppose the cropping pattern of an area is completely converted from certain food crops to a completely different set of crops in a short period. Will local food security considerations be adversely affected? This is yet another concern that scholars have raised. There are sustainability. I'm finishing.
Yeah. Okay.
There are sustainability concerns as well. Sustainability concerns here primarily mean, will the company bring in a set of technologies which are unsuitable for the sustainable cultivation in that particular region? There are also concerns related to labor displacement, large-scale use of child labor, which is something you see in Latin America a lot. All these are concerns. So the point here is, we need regulation, but we need good regulation of contract farming. Is this legislation that we have now a good legislation, or a good regulation, or a bad regulation? That is a point that farmers have raised and farmer organizations have raised. A lot of questions have raised with respect to the complete absence of the grievance redressal mechanism in the process, whereby a subdivisional magistrate is supposed to deal with the complaints instead of a court. So all these concerns are there, and the point is, nobody is actually opposing the legislation or the contract farming per se, but they are asking for good regulations of contract farming. That is the second point.
Okay.
So these are broadly the points that I wanted to raise with respect to the two important of the three legislations, which is APMC and contract farming. I would like to place this in front of you, and any other concerns that you might have, I'll be happy to take up during the question and
Sure,
answers. Thank you.
sure, Ramkumar, and I mean, sorry to interject. We were, and thank you for packing so much of an insight in those 20-25 minutes of time. Um, I'm sure we'll have an interesting discussion on many of these points that you have raised. Before moving on to the next speaker, I was just wondering on one of the points that you raised on the de facto on the slide on de facto. So the you agree that de facto the price policy and marketing policies, the policy framework generally has been hijacked by the large farmers and big traders, and it is in that pretext or background that you suggest that regulation is important, but this is not the kind of regulation that deals with the problem. Is that what you are suggesting? If you could just take 1 minute and we will
yeah,
move on
so
to the
slightly
next.
different. But the point I'm trying to make is we actually need more mandis. Okay. Why is it that the farmer is forced to sell in the village itself? It is partly because there are not enough mandis. It's partly because there are no aggregation facilities in the village itself. Okay. These two are the major reasons why that de facto point actually exists in the villages. Farmers cannot take it to a long 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers away to sell just about 50, 60, 70 or 100 kilograms of a particular product. So transaction costs are very high for the farmer. So they prefer to sell it in the village itself. If a private market comes, will this problem be resolved? That's a question we have to ask. Okay.
That's a question we'll take.
Will the private market take care of aggregation or not? If it takes care of aggregation, will it be at a higher or lower transaction cost? If the current, that transaction cost which will come in for the private trader or private market, if it is higher or larger than the current mandi tax structure, that the farmer will end up getting a lower price, not a higher price. That's my concern.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Ramkumar. Without any further delay, I think we should move on to our next proposition. Our next speaker today is Dr. Aparajita Bakshi. She is a development economist engaged in interdisciplinary teaching and research on issues of rural transformation, livelihood, poverty, and exclusion. She is the co-author with the Japanese scholar Professor J. Okabe of a prize-winning book titled A New Statistical Domain in India, an inquiry into village panchayat databases. Her forthcoming book explores the rural economy of the state of West Bengal. Aprajita has taught at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and National Law University of India, Bangalore. She is now an associate professor at the School of Economics and Finance, RV University, Bangalore. Aprajita, as I had said in my initial remarks, is going to speak on the viability of farming as an occupation, particularly as it is now practiced in India. Aprajita, may I welcome you and request you to start your presentation.
Thank you, Sandeepan. I will be discussing whether agriculture or farming is a viable occupation in India. And I will be just laying out some facts, from the current available data and statistics in India. I'll just be laying out what the data says about the viability of farming in India. So a large part of my presentation will be a lot of numbers, so please bear with me. Now, before I go into the question of viability, I want to first give you a brief overview or a description of who are these farmers, because very often I feel that in our minds we have some, or in media representations, in a lot of representations, we have some kind of, different notion of a farmer. Well, first of all, the farming, the share of the workforce that is in agriculture in India is, according to the National Sample Survey data, it's around 42% of the male and 55% of the female workforce are usually engaged in agriculture for major part of the year. While they're usually engaged in agriculture, agriculture may be their primary occupation, what in statistical terms we call a principal employment, or it might be their subsidiary occupation. So, they, a large part of their working time they spend in something else, and along with that they do farming. So it is a very heterogeneous group. You have heterogeneity in terms of how much time these workers spend in agriculture. So people whom we call farmers, some of them may be spending a very small portion of their time in agriculture. Rest of the time they might be running a business, or in a large majority of cases they might be doing other kinds of manual wage work. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you may have workers for whom agriculture is the sole employment and the entire labor time they spend in agriculture. The heterogeneity is also there in terms of their income portfolio. For some workers, agriculture is the only source of income. In fact, it's our studies show that for a very small portion of the workers, or very small portion of the rural households, agriculture is the only source of occupation. But yes, they are, you have households like that. They are not non-existent, that where agriculture is the sole source of incomes. And for many others, they are the major source of income. And there are very many farmers for whom agriculture and livestock are, they are not a major source of income. There is also heterogeneity in terms of the resources they have, the assets they have, and most importantly, the land they have. So, you have very, very small farmers with, if you look at a farmer in Bengal, in Bihar, where the land ownership is the smallest, they might have less than 1/3 of an acre as their ownership holding will be that small. As well as if you go to other parts of India, or even in the same villages in Bihar, you might find very large farmers owning up to hundreds of acres of land. So in terms of land ownership also, there is a huge heterogeneity. And you have people, you have farmers who are tenant farmers. You have large farmers who are leasing in from small farmers. You have small farmers who are leasing in from large farmers. You have different kinds of tenant farmers. So this this occupation of agriculture that we are talking about is a very, very heterogeneous occupation group. So there is a problem in identification of farmers as a homogeneous group. There is also, because of that, there is also a problem of identification of farmers' interests, because not all farmers share the same kinds of interests in terms of stake in various things, in the market or in a certain policy. Not all farmers will be similarly affected by everything. Now, in much of what I'm going to say today, I am going to use mainly two data sources. One is the NSS Situation Assessment Survey done in 2013. It's slightly dated, but that's the most recent we have in terms of published data. And I also use data from the PARI surveys that Sandeepan mentioned, the FA's PARI surveys in different villages. And so far, there are, I think, 27 villages that are covered under these surveys in 12 states in India. So I will kind of state my facts from both these data sources. Now, according to the situation assessment survey of NSS, they identified agricultural households, and they gave a kind of they defined agricultural households as those who received at least a minimum level of income from agriculture. That minimum was 3,000 rupees from agricultural produce, and at least one member was self-employed in agriculture. And they found that around 58% of the rural households are agricultural households. Out of these, around 70% of the agricultural households are marginal farmer households, which means they have less than 1 hectare of land. Very, very small land ownership. And another 17% are small farmers who have less than 2 hectares of land. So if you take these two groups, constituting about 87% of the agricultural households, they are very, very small farmers. So what kind of incomes do the agricultural households earn on the average? And the situation assessment data shows that incomes for agricultural households, the average levels of incomes from all sources taken together, agriculture, non-agriculture, all kinds of income sources, was around 6,426 per month in 2013 prices. So if I convert it to 2019 prices, it is around 9,500 rupees per month for the entire household. This is not per capita. So 9,500 is the average income roughly for the agricultural households in India, according to the, if you go by the SA's estimates. And as I said, this is the total income. About 60% of this income is from agriculture and livestock production. The remaining 40% comes from different other sources. It can be wages, salaries, non-farm businesses, etc. So if I am talking about only agriculture and livestock production, then less than 6,000 per month is coming from, in 2019 prices, in recent prices, is the income that is earned from agriculture, from farming. So, now to come to the question of, is farming viable? How do we define viability? And I will look at 3 kinds of indicators or aspects. Do they make profits? That is, are they at least able to cover their costs? Do they earn enough to sustain their consumption? And do they earn enough to avoid poverty? Now, to come to the first indicator, do they make profits? Yes. They, there is a section every year who make losses. And this, according to the situation assessment data, it is around 6.2% of the agricultural households make losses in crop production, and 21% make losses in animal husbandry. So there is a sizable section who actually do not make profits from agriculture and livestock farming in any particular year. Even the FA's data shows, in fact, there is probably no village where we have not found a single household who did not make a loss in agriculture and animal and livestock production in the year that the surveys were done. So there is always some households who are making a negative income. Sometimes the net household income is negative. That is, the incomes from that they get from other sources also do not compensate for the agricultural loss. And sometimes they are able to make a profit after accounting for other sources of income. Losses are more in the Kharif season than in the Rabi season, but also a smaller, because Rabi is mostly a irrigated season, so a smaller proportion of farmers actually cultivate in the Rabi season. Now coming to the second indicator of viability. Do they earn enough to sustain their consumption? Because at least you should have, if I say that, yes, I'm able to, farming is viable, at least I should be alive and be able to sustain my family. the situation assessment data shows that for the bottom 60% of the agricultural households, their average levels of incomes are actually lower than their average consumption expenditure. This survey collected data for both income and consumption from the same household, and for the poorest 60%, and that's a very large portion. The poorest 60%, they actually their average consumption expenditure is higher than incomes, which means that they are making income deficits, they are borrowing. That's why you find a very large proportion of rural households who are dependent on different kinds, who are indebted, and very often there is dependence on informal sources of money lenders, friends, etc. Informal sources of credit, because these are largely consumption loans. If I only take, I've made calculations that if I only take the incomes from crop production and animal husbandry, then this 60% goes up to 80%. So 80% of the poorest, or the poorest 80%, their average incomes are lower than their consumption expenditure. So that is the state of affairs. Now you can say that, okay, consumption expenditures, it might be higher, or people might be making different kinds of conspicuous consumption, expenditure in marriages, expenditure in different kinds of festivals. So what about their actual consumptions, or what they need for subsistence may be lower than their average consumption expenditure. It's a very elitist statement to make, but nevertheless we can argue for the sake of argument. So then comes my next question: do they earn enough? That means, do they earn enough for subsistence? Do they earn enough to avoid poverty? And the different poverty lines that we can use, they define nothing but subsistence levels of income and consumption. So what I have done is I've taken this situation assessment survey data, and I've taken the official poverty line, which is the Tendulkar poverty line, which was around 670 rupees per capita per month in 2010. And I found that 42.7%, roughly 43% of the agricultural households actually did not earn poverty line incomes. And again, if I take only their agricultural incomes from crop production and animals, then 2/3 of the agricultural households, 67%, actually do not earn poverty line incomes. I have also done different kinds of analysis with the PARI data, the FAS data from village surveys, and there is a wide variety of villages that from different agroclimatic zones and with different kinds of cropping patterns. And what I, because they do not collect data on consumption expenditure, what I have done is I have defined a minimum wage income. The government, the Labor Bureau, they declare a minimum wages in different occupations. So minimum wage in agriculture. So this minimum wage should be sufficient to, for a family of 3 to, so that is a kind of minimum income benchmark that is available to us. And I took this minimum wage in agriculture as the poverty benchmark, and I found that if I take incomes from crop production only crop production, then in these, and this is, I think this is data from 16 villages from the PARI database, 72 to 99% of the households, they do not have agricultural incomes. Whatever they're earning from crop production is not enough to meet this minimum wage. So basically, for large majority of farmers, what they are earning from crop production is lower than the minimum wage. or at least the stipulated minimum wage. And
Aparajita, just to let you know that you have about 4 to 5 minutes to wrap up
yes,
your presentation.
yeah, I'll be done by then. So, and if I add livestock production to it, then the percentage comes, just drops a little bit. 53 to 98% of the households, still do not meet the minimum wage standard. So, from these, these numbers, what we understand is that for a large majority of households who do agriculture, the incomes that they receive from agriculture are low by any standards. The incomes are not enough to match their consumption expenditures, and also the incomes are not enough to avoid poverty. But so who are these farmers who fall behind? Mainly, we see that it's mostly the small farmers who have very low incomes. And in my estimate, to earn an income entirely from agriculture and livestock that can meet consumption needs, a household requires at least a little above 2 hectares of land. And as I have showed you that, almost 90% of the agricultural households do not have 2 hectares of land. So it is very difficult to make a living, to make a decent living depending on agriculture alone, given the kind of land size and the kind of agricultural incomes that we have in India. And so, as Ramakumar also mentioned, this problem of scale is the most important problem in Indian agriculture today. Does that mean that rich farmers do not exist? Yes, rich farmers do exist. Agricultural entrepreneurs, the vision we have of agricultural entrepreneurs, software engineers coming in and doing agriculture, and even the rich Punjabi farmer, the farmer growing export crops, they do exist. It's not that they do not exist. They do exist, but they are a very minuscule section of the farming community in India. And so I will end by, just making 3 points. One, of course, it cannot be emphasized enough that this view of this capitalist farmer, green revolution farmer, agricultural entrepreneur, this kind of view that we see in policy circles, in many circles in the media about the farming community, that's a very small section of the farming community. And the large majority of farmers in India are small scale farmers. And in India at present, this kind of farming is not viable. Farmers do not get adequate incomes from farming. So, and the current government's approach, in fact, these farm bills and all, it comes from a long-standing policy approach, which you see in the report of doubling farmers' income, where the government acknowledges this problem of scale, but then as a solution, they think more of the increased role of private sector in marketing, or encouraging tenancy, contract farming. These kind of measures, market-led measures, will address the problem. And I am of the view, just like my colleague Ramakumar, that will not address the problem, because it's a very unequal structure that we have, and the small farmers are actually too weak to take advantage of the market. Like, most of them can't even go to a market to sell. And in contract farming, we have seen that even the big farmers, even the in contract farming, even the big corporates, they often do not want to go into contracts with small farming because there is a huge transaction cost involved. So,
yes, Aparajita, and thank you. Sorry for interjecting, and thank you for laying bare to us all the heterogeneities of the Indian rural and farming population, and to highlight the condition of the majority of farmers in India. So you have given us many striking numbers to think about, and I'm sure there will be many questions, and which we'll take up in the question answer session. I already see more than 20 questions in our Q&A box. One question that perhaps you can keep in mind and deal with it is, why, despite all this, why are these small farmers still in farming? A natural question to ask. With that, I think let us move on to the third presentation for this evening. I call upon our third expert, Madhura Swaminathan. She is the professor and head of the Economic Analysis Unit, Indian Statistical Institute, Bangalore, and chairperson of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, Chennai. She has a doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford and has worked on issues of food security, agriculture, and rural development for over 30 years. She recently co-edited a book titled Women and Work in Rural India. Madhura, in dealing with your subject, that is, the archetypal Indian farmer is a man, I understand that you will consider first the role of women in farming, and secondly, whether the participation of women in rural work is as limited as the official data often seem to suggest. So, with these questions, I hand over the platform to you, Madhura. Well, yeah.
Thank you, Sandeepan, and thank you to you, BIC. Several historians are of the view that women domesticated plants. In other words, while men were out hunting and fishing, women were the ones who discovered agriculture. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, and what we find is that women are hardly visible in the discussions of farmers and farming. And I'm not just talking about the media and the popular perception, but I'm talking about in policy discussions. When you have policies for rural, for agriculture, are women there in the decision making? Are women's voices heard? Are the policies sensitive to women's needs? And the answer is no. So what I want to argue today really is, why is this perception that women are not in farming? Perhaps there are many factors, and perhaps the most important in some way is the patriarchal society we are in and the norms that come from that about the role of men and women. There's also a very important question, which I'll not talk about today, but I must mention, which is about land ownership. If you look at the patterns of ownership of agricultural land, 85% or more is legally in the name of men. So women have legal entitlement to less than 15% of agricultural land. And usually these are women who are widowed or they are single women. So they're in households where there are no men. There are a few households with large land holdings where maybe there may be some land in the name of women in order to avoid ceiling legislation or for other reasons. But majority of land is in the name of men, and where it's women, it's usually women who've been abandoned in some way or the other, who are on their own. So I think this is also a very critical issue because land is the primary asset for agriculture. And the fact that land ownership is not in the name of women is really a very important concern for many of us. And maybe we can discuss this later. What I want to focus today is on women's work. And are women participating not just in crop cultivation, but in all the other allied activities related to agriculture? Now, here is where the problems arise. Problems of concepts, of definitions, of how we measure women's work. So let me start with the census of India that all of you are familiar with. In 2011, according to the census, 35% of rural women were counted as workers, and about 80% of them were in agriculture. So only about 1/3 of women in rural India are in the workforce. Now, this seems a very low number to some of us. Take another source, which is our regular labor force survey. These have been conducted over time for many, many years. And here too, we find that for the most recent, if I take the most recent year of 2017-18, according to the periodic labor force survey, which is what it's called now, only about 25% of rural women, and I'm talking here about women above the age of 15, so not talking about children, are active. In other words, are engaged in economic activity of some kind. And I'm going to spend a large part of this talk really telling you that I think this number is patently absurd, that only about a quarter of rural women are in the workforce. Now, let me give you an example of the problems with measuring women's work. A typical investigator in a labor force survey asks a woman, or a man for that matter, what were you doing for the major part of the last year? So were you engaged in economic activity? Were you working? Were you seeking work? In other words, were you unemployed? Or were you not working? So this question, the answer to this question about whether you're a worker is really based on the respondent, or the woman in this case, and what she perceives to be her main activities during the last year. So this is really one of the key problems in labor force surveys, that in countries like India, where large number of women are barely literate, in large parts of rural India, where the work that women do is scattered throughout the day. There's an hour of milking the cow in the morning, there's a couple of hours weeding late morning, there's something else in the evening. So the agricultural work is broken up, it's intermittent, it's not regular, it's not a 9-to-5 job. That very often, when you ask about perception, the women may report themselves as not working. So how do we address this problem? And there is a way, and that is through what are called time use surveys. As the word suggests, in this kind of survey, you don't ask, what were you doing last year? But you ask, for the last 24 hours, tell us all the activities you did. Let it be brushing your teeth, let it be cooking, let it be cleaning the cow shed, let it be work in the kitchen garden, or let it be harvesting the crop on the field. So describe all the activities. And in this way, we gather all this information and then decide whether a woman is a worker or is not a worker. Unfortunately, we don't have many of these in India. The first national time use survey was conducted in 2019, and the results were released at the end of last year. And I'll tell you what that tells us. It does just give us a slightly different picture. But before going into what we learned from that time use survey, I want to caution you that when I talk about work, today I'm focusing on what economists refer to as economic activity. Any work that falls within the boundary of national accounts, which is counted in our national income. So, for example, production of rice or production of milk, or if you keep chickens, production of eggs, all this is contributing to national income. So whether you sell it or you don't sell it, you keep it for home use. So whether it's wage employment or salaried employment or self-employment for your own farming enterprise, and whether it is sold or not, it is counted in national income, and therefore it's economic activity. I'm not talking today largely about another very important activity which takes up a lot of time of rural women, and that is care activities. Cooking, cleaning the house, bathing, care of the children, feeding them, care of the elderlies. I'll say something about this, but and whether this should be or shouldn't be also part of our national income. There's a debate now about wages for housewives or home workers. So that too is economic. I think it's important. But today I'm going to stick to what is nationally recognized as economic activity, what is counted in our national income. So if you look at that definition and take the time use survey of 2019, we found that about 25%, 24% of women were engaged in employment, that is, they were paid for their work, and about 28% of women were engaged in various activities of production of what are called goods and services, as I said, production of milk, which may not be sold, which may be for your own family consumption. So you may keep cattle and keep the milk for your own consumption. And we calculated that about 44% of rural women in 2019 had participated in one of these economic activities during the 24-hour recall period. So this time use survey that was done in India asked only for 1 day, for 24 hours. And this works out to be about 200 million women. And that's 2019, so that's pretty contemporary. The census of India, which I started with, said there are 96 million rural workers. So this number has almost been doubled by the estimate we get from the time use survey. Now, I'm actually going to argue that even this national survey is perhaps not adequate and is perhaps undercounting women. And why is that? Let me give you an example from 2 villages that we surveyed along at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies in Karnataka. One village was in Mandya district and one village was in Kolar district. And we did something different. We surveyed women, a small group of women, but we surveyed them for a week. So we asked data on what they did for 24 hours for 7 weeks consecutively and for 7 days consecutively. And then we repeated this 2 times. In the lean season, in April, May, when it's very hot, but in the time when there is no rain and there's no agricultural activity or very little, and then again in the harvest season. And what did we find? So when we looked at, and we took a much more stringent definition of work than what the National Time Use Survey, which I just told you, did, and even which the Government of India's official labor force survey. We said during this week, did you spend the majority of time, since we had time for every day of the week, did you spend the majority of time in economic activity? And only then did we call the woman a worker. So let me repeat again, 2 seasons, 7 days continuously, and we visited the woman twice a day at least to ask, what did you do from 6 a.m.? And then in the evening, we went back and said, what did you do since the time we left you at 10 or 11 in the morning? And what is the answer that we got? So one is a dry village, Sirisandra in Kolar, which is has a lot of sericulture, and the other is Mandya district, a rice and sugarcane growing village, the Kaveri irrigation system. In the lean season, in the 2 villages, 64 to 70% of women were workers, about 2/3. And I just told you that the national number says about less than 1/3 of workers. And in the peak season, in the harvest time, 82 to 90% of women were workers. So what is the message, or what is the lesson that we get from here? I think what we have understood is that when there is agricultural work, women are engaged in it. Women are in the fields, women are plucking tomatoes, women are transplanting the rice crop. Now, I don't want to generalize from 2 villages to the rest of India, But I think this little sort of deep study of two villages is telling us something, that perhaps the problem is not adequate availability of employment for rural women, not that women are not engaged in economic activity or are not willing to be engaged in economic activity. Now, what I've said is, of course, for two villages, and it's very difficult to generalize for all of India. We know that in some parts of India, like Punjab, where you have wheat cultivation, which is highly mechanized, there are not many women taking part in field operations and actual crop operations. Whereas in rice growing areas, be it in West Bengal or be it in Andhra Pradesh or Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, many of the operations, particularly transplanting of rice and harvesting of rice, women engage in it actively. So there are huge variations across India, across seasons, depending on the cropping pattern. But nevertheless, women's participation in agricultural activities, even in direct crop production, is very high, is the point I'm trying to make. Women are also engaged. Yes.
Yeah,
a couple of minutes.
Yes.
Sure. No, less than that. I'll wrap up. It's been a long session. So it's very difficult to generalize, is what I'm saying, across different parts of India. We also, of course, have things like mechanization taking place. And some of you may not be aware that, but not be surprised by knowing that COVID and the pandemic actually led to greater mechanization, because people wanted machines rather than workers on their fields to reduce contact. And mechanization often displaces women. We don't find many women tractor drivers or operating threshers. But nevertheless, there are women very active in different kinds of field operations, on homesteads. And another thing we find is that if a family has cattle, be it 1 or 2 or 3 cows or buffaloes, or some chickens or some goats or pigs, women are invariably engaged in feeding and cleaning and grazing the animals and milking and so on. Again, if it's a very large poultry unit, you may not find women, but whereas it's a small household unit, you do find women. So again, this question of scale that has been brought up by the previous speaker changes the degree of engagement of women. Another point which is worth making before I end is that women, we find there's a different degrees of participation on their own farms, but a lot of women from small peasant families, those owning 1 acre, 2 acres, 3 acres, work on others' fields. And sometimes the degree of engagement on others' farms is even higher than what it is on their own fields. Because many small farmers in India, it's a myth that small farmers, that's another myth, entirely cultivate on the basis of their own family labor. For many operations, when there's a time restriction, when there's a specific operation with a specific skill like transplanting of rice, even small farmers hire labor. So women work on their own farms, women also work on others' farms. So let me try to wind up now by saying that what I'm trying to say is that if we improve the method by which we improve our concepts and definitions, the way in which we collect data, we are going to find that a large majority of women are active in agriculture, and we need to bring them into the decision-making forum. We need to bring them to the policy making arena now. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Madhura Swaminathan. You have spoken about the limitations of the official methods and concepts, and you have also thrown light on the possibility of newer methods, like time use. And I am really glad to see that the data generated by the archives of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies have been used by you as well as Professor Dr. Aparajita Bakshi. For those of you interested, you can find more about the foundation at fas.org.in. We also have a journal called called the Review of Agrarian Studies, an international online first, print next, open source journal, which is available at the ras.org.in. Let me now open the floor for questions. We already have, I mean, I must say that the number of, we are inundated with questions, more than 25 questions in our Zoom Q&A box. So what I will do is about, say, a couple of questions or maybe three questions I'll put to each of the speakers, and then you can sort of respond to these questions, and also if there is something that you would want to speak on. So let's start with the last speaker, Madhura. The three questions that I have, I see for you. One that says that, speaking of land rights and women in agriculture and various land use norms, what would be your response to the concerns to the development around agriculture's what perhaps the person is trying to ask is, what are the different activities in agriculture, tasks in agriculture that women are involved in? Is there any gender specific division of labor in agriculture? So that is one question that I would like you to address. The second question is that, does the need for the BPL card dissuade women from giving their actual work or employment status in agriculture? So this is another question maybe which you can address. And a third question that let me put to you is, how are the time use surveys a viable form of judging a woman's work when it only, so this questions the time use survey method used by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. So when it takes into consideration only a 24-hour time period, there is a possibility that work done throughout the year or even in the time period isn't, cannot be generalized. So these are the questions, if you would like to take up.
I think, let me take the BPL question first. See, the BPL card is given by say a local government organization, the block development office or the panchayat office, which is trying to document your status in terms of BPL or APL. Whereas the labor force survey is a sample survey on a large scale, which is done by another independent statistical agency. So it's very important. And when we, for example, go as researchers, it's very important to explain that it's not linked to any government benefit. So we assume that we are getting answers from people which are truthful and not linked to the idea that it's tied to some benefit like getting a BPL card. Now, on the time use survey, this is something that has been used internationally and in many countries. It's not something only used in India. Yes, it is a snapshot of 24 hours, but there is an option for the respondent to say whether that was a normal 24 hours or whether that was a special day, like a marriage day, which is not a normal day. And I think we overcame that. And in fact, I would say the study that I reported is unique internationally. I have not found any other study of this kind. We asked for 7 days continuously and across seasons, so in different phases of economic activity. So hopefully we've managed to capture some of the variation. On the gender division of labor, this is a very important question and requires a whole seminar on its own. There is a gender division of labor. Traditionally, men did plowing and women weren't involved in that. Now, as I said, men drive the tractors. But I think also things change with technological change, with institutional change. Men are entering women's occupations, women are entering men's occupations. And very often in agriculture now, in large parts of India, for example, say harvesting of rice is done by a team or a group of men and women workers together. So the gender division of labor is not rigid. It is something that is also changing over time. And I didn't discuss today, but in states like Bihar, where there's large outmigration of men, we need to study what are the operations that women do, because women are being left there and they are the ones who are managing all the agricultural tasks.
Okay. So, okay, so very interestingly, the last your response ends up bringing out the issue of migration, which I would like to link up to the questions that have been thrown to Dr. Aparajita Bakshi. So, the first question that I would like you to dwell upon is, do small farmers have no choice, and can't they leave farming? Something that was in my mind, and I see a similar question being raised. And the second question that to you is, relates to the question of scale as the key issue in agriculture that you spoke about. So the question is that the only solution that would genuinely benefit farmers would seem to be collectivized agriculture, or maybe cooperatives or farm produce organization is what she means, either through land nationalization or nationalized agriculture under the aegis of the state, or through large scale farmer collectives along with land reform. So yeah, please, this is the broad idea of the question. If you could respond to that idea as well. How do they collectivize, and what will that bring scale to them?
Yeah, I'll take the first question first. That do small farmers have a choice? Small farmers definitely do not have a choice. And so, why do they linger in agriculture? Why are they still farming? Uh, and that is, to understand that dynamics, you have to look outside of agriculture. That while they do not make adequate incomes in agriculture, I strongly believe that the non-agriculture, it is the failure of the non-agricultural sector, who have not been able to kind of give adequate employment, enough employment, so that some of the farmers can make an exit outside of agriculture. Because if you look at one of the major problems in India is that while the share of output of agriculture has really contracted, but the share in employment has not really shrunk so much. So and there's a I have argued in some of my writings that it is they linger in agriculture because there are not enough days of employment outside of agriculture, because uh, wages are not high enough. And it's not only about the days of employment, it is about skill appropriate employment, because the kind of skills they have, at least in that labor market, there is not adequate jobs for them. That is why you find a lot of, they are trying to make ends meet in different ways. They engage in a lot of, very petty trade. They migrate to other parts of the country, and a large part of the migration is actually circular migration, where they only migrate for short periods for a part of the year to make some incomes, then come back and do agriculture in their own villages again. So it is definitely not a choice. In fact, CSDS had done a study where they had asked farmers, and 76% said that no, given a choice, we would have left farming. So that is one. About collectivization of agriculture, yes, when scale is a problem, some kind of aggregation, collectivization at some level is required. But the major block I feel in collectivization in India is our unfinished land reforms. In most of the states, you basically did not have land reform. So there is this huge heterogeneity of farmers. And even when you have cooperatives, you have seen that how that same inequality that you have in land ownership, that is perpetuated in the cooperative. So to bring farmers together, you need some, some similar stakes, similar interests, some kind of uniformity, and our. So it is a kind of lost opportunity, and that creates problems in collectivization. But of course, we still have models. There are farmer producers companies and farmer producer organizations, etc. SAGs, Kerala, we have seen that collectivization through women's SAGs in farming. So these kind of efforts are required more to bring about collectivization, aggregation at the level of production. You can also have collectivization at the level of marketing, and sometimes collectivization in certain labor use, like whether you can do certain operations together, rent machinery together. So that collectivization can happen at different levels and for different things, and that will be, what will be the appropriate design depends on the farming system of that particular area.
Okay.
So but that's the only way out, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for your response. In fact, I'm sorry to say that we are not able to take a lot of questions, and a lot of questions is on the methods that Dr. Aparajita has used or Professor Madhura has used. So this is not, will not be able to take such questions, but certainly, if interested, they can be taken up all offline. So now coming finally to Professor Ramakumar. So again, a lot of questions have been directed to you, naturally. So perhaps given the debate around the issue. So two things that one is, of course, the point that you left, you could not cover at that point, was the Essential Commodities Act. And a second was a question, that a sense that I see from the questions is, why only the, whether it is the success of the APMC or whether it is the protest, why is there a centeredness in Punjab and Haryana? So this is a sense that I'm getting from many of the questions. So maybe you can take these two questions and dwell upon them. Professor Ramkumar, please unmute yourself. Please unmute.
Sorry. It's not surprising that, I'll take the second one first. It's not surprising at all that the protests are centered more in Punjab and Haryana, because that's where the APMC mandis have the highest density of presence in India. Farmers there have felt the sense of security in terms of prices and marketing that they provide to them year after year. And they very clearly see that they might lose access to that stable market, which provides them with a remunerative price year after year. And that fear is something that brings them more to the street than farmers in other states where they are present in a lesser density. I had mentioned this when I was speaking, that the density of presence of APMC markets are varying across India. Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, and all have a much higher presence, a much better presence of APMC mandis compared to other parts of India. That's precisely why we see this whole de facto problem that I mentioned, which is that farmers being forced to sell in the village itself and not being able to take it to a nearby APMC market, but actually a faraway APMC market. That raises their costs of transport and so on. So this is the reason why I think we need more APMC mandis, not less. That's extremely important. And this is where public investment becomes extremely important. There's one question in the Q&A session, Q&A box, which is asking what is to be done. It is very simple. There is much more public investment that needs to go in to the establishment of thousands of more APMC markets in India. Right? We just don't need. Also, we don't need all of them to be APMC mandis of the size that we have today. They can be smaller markets, which are formed by associations of traders and farmers together, by cooperatives, by FPOs. All of that, we can have a mix of all that, but the state has to play a facilitating role, sometimes interventionary, sometimes coming in with investment, sometimes playing the leading role where other players are not ready to come. So you need a mix of all that, and it cannot be simply a method whereby you open up your laws, you expect that private players, corporate players will automatically come and replace the APMC mandis. That is not going to happen. In fact, the Bihar case, what it tells you is that systematically functioning markets are going to be replaced by unregulated, non-systematically functioning markets, which are actually more harmful to the farmer than the poorly functioning regulated markets also. Okay, that's a key point to remember here. What is your first question, Sandeepan? I forgot.
The Essential Commodities
Act. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So the Essential Commodities Act, essentially what it tells you is that if you remove all the, basically what does it say? It basically says that private investment will come into storage and warehousing in a big way if stock limits are taken away. Stock limits are the reason why private investments are not coming into storage and warehousing. That is the key point. I start from the reasoning itself. Is it the stock limit that is preventing private investment coming into storage and warehousing? In my view, no. In my view, storage and warehousing does not see adequate private investment for a very different reason. That is because, as Aparajita was mentioning earlier as well, we have large numbers of small and marginal farmers who cultivate a variety of crops. A heterogeneous cropping pattern is followed in small plots of land, which makes the cropping pattern very fragmented in nature. We don't have like in the US or the European context, next 500 acres or 100 acres will be cultivated with a single crop. No, say tomato, potato. We don't have that kind of a cropping pattern. What this means is the absence of a homogeneity in cropping pattern. What this leads to is a complete fragmentation of the surplus. When there is fragmentation of the surplus, there is no incentive for a private investor to come and invest huge amounts in storage or warehousing. That's where the state has to come in and play the central role. The private investor has absolutely no financial incentive, economic incentive to come and play that role. However, and this is precisely why the government has schemes like, for example, one district, one crop. Why does the government have a scheme like that? It is basically to encourage some amount of homogeneity in the cropping pattern so that there'll be homogeneity in the surplus so that other private investments can come in. Yes, that may, but one district, one crop scheme is a big failure. We don't see any of it anywhere in India. So as long as we have that kind of homogeneity, private investment will not come. But some places, some pockets, some crops, some states may see the coming in of private investment into storage and warehousing. And that's precisely the context in which Adani, large groups like Adani, are actually positioning themselves in the retail market or supply chain. Adani, for example, recently took over a company called Snowman Logistics. What is Snowman Logistics? Snowman Logistics is a cold chain provider in India, which controls 40% of India's cold chain supply. Okay, so Adani already has the largest ports, the largest airports. It has already got on the other side on the retail Adani Agri Fresh. Now it has got a huge presence in the cold chain supply chain. It's also all this basically takes us to an American model of agricultural marketing and for market formation, whereby few duopolistic or monopolistic kind of players control the buying on the one side and large numbers of farmers exist on the other side, which creates a complete, it does not provide a level playing field at all. It provides enormous, it provides a platform for enormous inequalities to emerge, exclusions to come in and so on, which is not good for an efficient agricultural marketing system. That is the problem I see with the essential commodity. It's completely misplaced. Its objective is completely misplaced.
Okay, thank you, Ramkumar. I think with this we have almost exhausted all the time. There was a segment that we thought we can do where each of the speakers can perhaps put up a question to the others, but unfortunately that given the time limits, we would not be able to take that up today. Also, there are many questions that remain unanswered that as I've already pointed out. So maybe that indicates the need for another session on agriculture, on the myths about Indian agriculture. So with these words, let me thank each of the speakers, Professor Ramakumar, Dr. Aparajita, and Professor Madhura Swaminathan. Let me also thank the Bangalore International Center for giving us this platform where we could discuss themes and propositions which are otherwise not much discussed, if I may say that. And also to all the participants and panelists who helped us conducting this event. Back to you, Lekha.
Thank you, Professor Ramakumar, Ms. Bakshi, and Dr. Swaminathan for those three distinct voices and approaches to understanding a much idealized and to a large extent underappreciated and understood aspect that is rural and farming lives. I think with this, we can say that these myths are officially busted. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Sandeepan, for this sparkling panel together and for making this happen. Thank you, everybody who made time and attended this session. And with that, I can only say thank you and good night, and see you next time.